me go ahead and resume. There we go. So I'm so glad that you're here. Thank you. My name is Miriam Hacker. I'm Senior Research Implementation Lead at the Water Center, also coordinator or project lead for this Heinz-funded initiative to develop Southwestern Pennsylvania Water Network. And so for today's session, we're going to cover just a few things. I want to make sure that there's plenty of time for folks to ask questions and really just give space to answer the questions I haven't thought of or that are already available. But I do want to give a quick overview at the beginning. So we'll go over the development of the water network over the last few years, as well as reviewing the request for proposals. Transitional funding was referred to in the RFP, but we have a little bit more information that we can provide today about that, as well as going over some submission guidelines and some of those logistical considerations. And then we'll open up the floor to questions and answers. If at any point you've got questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. Some I might just go ahead and answer right there on the spot because it's relevant to what we're already covering. Otherwise, I will definitely refer back to them at the end of quick presentation, giving a little bit more background information. So thank you, everyone. So appreciate you being here, and hopefully you find this session useful. So just the basics. Actually, I'm curious to see how many of the people here are already connected in some way to the water network. There's a lot of familiar faces, and so good to see you. There's also faces that I haven't necessarily met yet. So if you are familiar with the network, please just hit a little emoticon at the bottom of your screen. Okay. Fantastic. So this probably will be a pretty high level overview, but do want to make sure that we cover the essentials. What is the essence of the water network? Well, first off, there's a vision statement. And not even before we even go into the vision statement, I want to clarify that the whole point of this project was to create a locally led initiative to pursue this vision statement. How do we bring together local leaders that are already in this work, already doing the work, and how do we bring them together for ensuring that water resources in the Southwestern Pennsylvania area are sustainably, equitably, and collaboratively managed, and with the purpose of protecting public health and the environment to enhance that community and system resilience, and to make sure that we're able to deliver economic, ecological, and social benefit to everyone. And so from that vision statement, the activities for the network have been broken down into 4 key goals. So different activities that take place are trying to target one of these different areas. So 1, creating a regional identity. 2, creating a safe, open, productive space. How do we facilitate conversation where people from differing backgrounds and perspectives can come together and have those constructive conversations? How do we move forward in the area or in the region with these different viewpoints? And where's a space that's neutral ground for people to have that conversation? 3rd, leveraging and amplifying existing efforts. Especially at the Water Center, we recognize that there's already really amazing initiatives in this space. This isn't something that is starting completely fresh. There are already really strong initiatives, really strong players, really strong activities in Southwestern Pennsylvania. And so rather than trying to recreate the wheel or duplicate efforts, how do we leverage existing efforts, existing partnerships in order to create additional progress or to strengthen existing relationships? So the last part is improving information and data sharing. So wanting to be a space where people can go to find the right person. It doesn't necessarily have to be the spot that contains all the information, but if I'm trying to figure out who is doing what in what space, is there someone that I can look to, or is there a network where I can connect with other folks? And so some of this is related specifically, excuse me, how rude. Some of this is specifically related to data information in the region, but other parts of it is just general information about who is doing what in this space. And so to kind of give a quick overview, in the Water Center at Penn, I like to break this into 3 different general areas of involvement. And I will say my time actually started last March. So I'm building off of pre-existing work done by Allison DeLuise and other members of the Water Center at Penn. But this work really started in 2018 and 19. I would say it's more in a time period of research and engagement, figuring out what is the current landscape in southwestern Pennsylvania regarding the water sector. So a number of informational interviews were conducted with folks, and some reports were developed based on those conversations to identify what the challenges, opportunities were, as well as recommendations from local stakeholders. And one of the key recommendations was it would be really useful if there was a collective space where people could come together, some sort of entity or coalition. And from those recommendations, work was started to build a foundation for a water network. So first off, you always want to know what you don't know and what you do. And so there are a few best practices reports that were developed. One was looking at other networks and coalitions and how they formed. What were their funding cycles? What were their organizational structures? What did that look like? And what can we learn and see what works best for the region? And secondly, there was a data landscape report. So similar to phase one, we wanted to target in and zone in on data in the region. How is data being generated, shared, and processed, and who is using it? And what are some challenges that exist in that space? And are there ways that we can improve it? What do people see as being the next best step? So from building off of this landscape, first, once you understand the context, wanting to build a foundation. So I'm so glad that we've got some of our previous and current strategic working group members here in this conversation today. But a strategic working group was established. I kind of like to think of it as the tugboat of the network. So people that are active in the water sector and in the region, but also helping make some of these high-level recommendations about where the network could go and some of that strategic direction. And so strategic working group came together. We also had a lot of opportunities for consensus building as a unit. So we had all network meetings where people could get together and understand who is interested in what in the region, what activities or initiatives are already ongoing, and then also building off of those in smaller informational webinars. We have those focused more on data resources in the region, and we've also had a couple initial meetings for water education outreach. And so from this foundation, from these initial opportunities to participate, we were able to develop some general recommendations for what this framework would look like for the water network. So understanding vision, purpose, and goals, as well as leadership and participation structure, recognizing that the water network genuinely takes a network approach. It's not organizational. And so how do you instill leadership in all aspects of participation? And then lastly, hub recommendation, I'm sorry, that's internal lingo, but trying to figure out what would be a viable option for hosting the network long-term? How do you ensure longevity? And so I'd like to pause right now, and I can go over these bullet points all the time, but I'd actually like to speak to some of the strategic working group members. If you have been or currently are on the strategic working group and have been involved in this process, I'd like to just kind of get your sense of your first impressions when you were getting involved about the culture of the group. What was something that stood out to you about the network versus other initiatives that you've been in?
Hi, everybody. Miriam, this is Heather Manzo, Executive Director at Allegheny County Conservation District. Happy New Year to everybody. And so I'm one of the individuals who have had varying level of engagement over the last 2 years. And the culture of the group has really been wayfinding towards the moment in time that we are at now, which is figuring out where this thing can live and have local ownership. And one of the central truths of that work has been, how can that truly be a place that would be neutral? And so a cornerstone of all this work is, how can this work happen and honor all of the participants and, be inclusive and continue to welcome people in an ebb and flow style rather than have a very firm structure, but continually take in ideas, continually process ideas, continually try to connect the dots and create ways that people can be connected and help hold each other's work in esteem, but also potentially get to greater results together. And knowing that a way to do that is to make sure that the hub has neutrality to it and does not sort of have the overriding bias of a host organization. And so I love that there's all of those pieces to this work, and it's been really great to be a part of it. And just from prior professional experience working in network development in food policy realm, that there's a lot of power in a network that is held communally like this. And so it's just exciting to see what happens next. It's been an honor to work with so many talented people in the region on this in the Water Center. So thanks.
Thanks, Heather. Any of our other prior or existing strategic working group members that want to speak to the culture? I think if I could just briefly summarize 2019 and 2021, to me, from an outsider coming in and really trying to facilitate some of these conversations, it's really been intentional with trying to establish trust and trying to establish connections first. So people feel like they have this space that they can connect with one another before starting to think about the tangible next steps and starting to think about what can we connect around? What are those common issues that everyone's working with that we can go after together? But anyone else from the strategic working group that would like to say a couple things about the culture of the group or the culture of the network that you've seen and experienced?
Mayor, this is Matt. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah, this is Matt Genscher. I work for White Township in Indiana County. I was drawn to the group from the beginning. I've always been involved in water resource collaboratives, whether it be stormwater or drinking water protection. And one of the things that really always made that work was bringing people together that don't normally meet or don't have a reason or a mechanism to engage on a regular basis. And I think as we've developed this from 19 to now, that's one of the things that we've always tried to do is keep a diverse group of folks on the working group. Try to bring in new folks to the network that makes sense. Try to include as many facets as we can, because I'm always a firm believer that you don't always have to have a direction for a meeting, but sometimes just getting together and getting in the room and just having conversations is valuable in itself. And I think that's what this network is drawing toward is, we all come from different backgrounds, different perspectives. We may not even all necessarily deal with water directly, but maybe a part of what we do. And that's all important whenever you're trying to come up with better projects or come up with, greater ideas. And sometimes it's hard for people in, say, Washington County to connect with somebody in Butler County or Indiana County or even further north. So I think as this is developing, our hope is that whatever group ultimately gets selected to host this network and continue to develop it understands that there really isn't a right answer on how it's going to move forward, and to remain flexible, because that's what's made it strong so far. So we're definitely one of the strengths of it. So I look forward to seeing who, those that are going to apply and continue us on this path moving forward. So thanks.
Thanks so much, Matt. Really appreciate it. And we'll go over the timelines and selection process and what that looks like at the very end as well, so that people have an understanding of the structure of what we're doing. So I would say that going into the present, exactly what both Matt and Heather had mentioned about creating that space and also understanding how do we create points of contact for folks that might not otherwise be meeting together. And so right now, currently in the process behind the scenes with Water Center folks of creating a visual directory for members focused on subject area expertise and geographic region. I also want to emphasize that I won't be able to cover everything in this talk. So I'm thinking of all these different points. I'm like, no, everything's important. But this network is currently composed of 10 counties, and in the network membership as well as the strategic working group, there is an emphasis on making sure that there's diversity of perspective, lived experiences, and even geographic region as well, recognizing that the conversations that are happening in urban areas are also happening in rural spaces, and how do we bridge that gap? Maybe that gap doesn't exist, but how do you strengthen and maintain the connections that are there? And so trying to also create, right now, we're also trying to create that visual directory so that people can connect if they don't necessarily have the opportunity to do so, but also trying to create a central map for current data resources. Is there a space that you can go to if you're not sure of what data exists and who's collecting it? And can we kind of compile all that understood institutional knowledge into one space and make it look pretty? So we are working on that right now. Finally, we're also strengthening the foundation for the network. So we've continued with the strategic working group in our second cohort. And we're also in the process, as you see here, selecting a host organization. There's been continued meaningful participation building off that initial momentum from all network meetings in prior years. So we've been having informal networking sessions. Some of you have attended those, water education outreach. We also had initial conversation about interactions with the Ohio River Basin Alliance. And there's others to come as well. So taking all the information that people presented in all network meetings about what they care about, how do we continue those conversations in smaller settings that are informal and give space for people to get to know one another and potentially do some joint collaboration. So I'd like to take a point right now to review the RFP and the general structure of it. Yeah. So you should already have access to this. I will go ahead and include a copy of it in the chat as well. So thanks for your patience for that. I'll do that in just a minute. But wanted to make sure that you were aware of all the information that's contained in there, of course, more than what I'm able to share today, but really going through what is the objective for this process, the geographic region, we have mentioned that a little bit. But we also wanted to go through and really detail, Matt had mentioned flexibility, and he's absolutely right. Even based on conversations I've heard from the strategic working group who's overseeing this process, there's not necessarily the perfect host organization that people already have in mind, but people do understand, the strategic working group understands what they know it should do and what it shouldn't do. There's some lines in the sand, but not necessarily like this ideal type. And so that gives some space for flexibility, recognizing that the host organization, cut off, there we go. The host organization is going to be administering funding for the network. They are going to be that administrative function where when funding organizations or foundations want to provide funding or grants, there needs to be some sort of entity that the funding goes to. So that's the role of the host organization. Also, as a result, they are the official employer for a local coordinator and supporting the ongoing development for the network through insight and supportive guidance. So being able to, from an administrative standpoint, provide some insight just based from past experience of hosting other entities. Potentially providing operational support. So how is the network going to communicate? Right now it's communicating via Basecamp. However, most likely recommendation from the Water Center and other project partners would be that it has an external facing front. And so that would require a website and some operational support as well. Want to encourage creative freedom for the network. So one thing that we'll come back to regularly, and I guess I won't go through every single bullet point here, but one thing that really is emphasized in conversations with the strategic working group is being hosted with autonomy. So not necessarily being absorbed into the host organization's activities, but providing a space for the network to exist and to thrive and pursue its vision based on the goals that it's set for itself and on the structure that it's created for itself. And so that being said, funding and ongoing support is not necessarily the responsibility of the host organization. That's the responsibility for the network itself. But a host organization might be interested in providing indirect support. So identifying potential opportunities, helping create relationships between funding organizations and the network, potentially going after joint proposals as well. Yeah, so I think that's something that's also been highlighted is when a host organization is submitting a proposal, are they agreeing that they are now financially responsible for the network? And in conversations, it's been said no. Direct support is the responsibility of the strategic working group, the local coordinator, as well as the network members itself. It's a collective effort. And lastly, an open exchange of data and information within the network. So really wanting to encourage a network approach thrives on transparency rather than a hierarchy of information and communication. And so the host organization is not responsible for serving as a supervisor for local coordinator. So there's a delicate relationship between employing a local coordinator and then working with the strategic working group who is overseeing the responsibilities of that coordinator role. The vision and the scope and the direction of the network has already been determined by the network itself through recommendations provided by the strategic working group and consensus from broader network members. It's already been decided, so there's no need to necessarily take that oversight role. And I think that conflicts with that idea of hosting with autonomy. And let's see. Lastly, we recognize this might be a small point, but we recognize that the local coordinator, even though they're technically employed by the host organization, that doesn't necessarily mean it requires physical space to operate. And so I think the strategic working group is interested in hearing people's proposals. I think through the proposal process, it'll be curious to see what potential host organizations propose and what they dream, and recognizing that each organization provides a different experience. And so there is flexibility, and we understand that. So we're curious to see what people propose. One thing I really want to emphasize, though, is the posturing of the host organization. So it isn't necessarily to oversee and to run the network, but rather to help reinforce that neutral space for the network to operate. And I think that's a bit nuanced, but hopefully is clear. And hopefully will be emphasized within the proposals that are submitted. There's a bit of background information. I won't cover that today. I'll give you space. If you have any questions, please feel free to bring those up. But I do want to emphasize the network approach. Please, if you have a chance, take a look at this. It is, when you hear network versus organization or organizational approach, I think sometimes you're like, oh, okay, yeah, that's fine. But if you actually dive into what the essence of that is, it's very different. And I know for me, my background is civil environmental engineering, and so I'm very concrete sequential, and an organizational structure is what I'm very comfortable and used to. And the network approach has been an adjustment, recognizing that rather than a hierarchy of information and exchange, it's actually co-creation by network members and strategic working group members. It's really an emphasis on local leadership and trying to understand there's flexibility, like Heather and also Matt had talked about. You're going after where the energy is. Where are people interested in going? There's ebbs and tides and flows, and you need to be able to recognize where that is and then being able to take some strategic steps towards it. See here. One other thing that I want to emphasize is that there are relevant documents and links to those in the report. I will also put a link to the project page at the Water Center, because that provides a huge overview of these documents as well as other more regular updates. So for example, there's newsletters that have been sent out. There have been notes from prior meetings, different summary reports. So in addition to these, there's additional context if you'd like that. So I'll put that link in there. And we'll go over submission guidelines in a minute. And the last thing is that the criteria that's been created has been discussed internally probably for the last year or so with strategic working group, trying to understand what is it that is of most importance for the network to be able to thrive in this configuration. And so please take a look. I think I'll emphasize a couple things in a minute, but these have really been intentionally thought through and considered by a strategic working group, and will be how the metric is developed for reviewing proposals. Just a couple more slides, so bear with me, and then we'll open it up for questions. Appreciate your patience with this. And if you do have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. So again, key points to focus on: being able to demonstrate that you understand that relationship between a host organization and the strategic working group. And really, how do you understand that phrase, being hosted with autonomy? Hopefully the RFP provides sufficient detail, and if it still isn't clear, please feel free to reach out. I can provide additional information, but understanding what do healthy boundaries look like between the network and the host organization. So recognizing that a lot of folks and a lot of organizations work in the water space already, how does that affect your involvement in the network versus your ability to host the network? That is definitely something that should be included and delineated pretty clearly. As well as understanding, I think something that is of more importance that's been taken from conversations with strategic working group is that I think people are really interested more about the prior experience with hosting entities versus your involvement in the water sector. And so I think some cases organizations might feel like because they have such a space in the sector that it's an added advantage. However, the emphasis for this process is really making sure that there's a space that the that the water network can thrive and can be autonomous, but also being able to function in a healthy relationship. So being able to demonstrate that. So in terms of transitional funding, the Water Center at Penn had talked with the Heinz Endowments. They have been generously funding this initiative from the start. And we had spoken with them about continued funding or some transitional funding as we identify a host organization. And because of the timing of the grant cycles and the proposal periods, an arrangement was made to use the Community Foundation for the Alleghenies. They were very gracious in being willing to administer funds once a host organization was identified. And so the amount available for the host organization is about $142,000. The total amount is $150,000, but there's a 5% overhead that goes to CFA. The funding period is for 1 year. And with the transition that takes place with the host organization, once they're selected, the Water Center at Penn will work with trying to create a seamless transition to the host organization, identifying a local coordinator, as well as trying to set up the network for success. So being able to ensure that relationships with those funding organizations are made, and we can put the organization and the network on the best foot forward. The contract type is to be decided by the strategic working group in coordination with the CFA. And so we've had several conversations with CFA, and they're just very supportive group of folks and very happy to be working with them. And their positioning from this is really to work together with the strategic working group to see what's the best path forward and how do we create accountability as well as a seamless transition. Yeah, Emily.
Can you explain or just give some examples of what you mean by contract type?
Yeah, for example, so the grant has already been administered to CFA, but how is that going to be administered to the host organization? And so it probably won't be a lump sum at the very start of the entity, but what does that look like? What are the milestones that people can check in with? Yeah. And so just to kind of go over, this is what was proposed to Heinz Endowments for that $150,000. So this is what potential host organizations can expect from that transitional funding. Funding for a local network coordinator, as well as part-time administrative support, travel, supplies, and conference costs, recognizing that all network meetings have been so critical. The last one that we had over 130 people registered, had 80 folks set up. I don't know what's going to look like with COVID, but recognizing that that really is the energy of the network, is making sure people can come together. So making sure that there's supplies for that. And lastly, submitting a proposal. I need all of your folks' help right now, because we ran into a little issue yesterday with the portal. It was requiring a Google sign-in to submit a proposal. And so what I'm going to go ahead and do here is add in the official RFP. There we go. And hopefully you have this information already, but if you don't, here it is. If you go down to the link where you can submit a proposal, if at some point you can go ahead and click that link and make sure that you go to a Google form. I just want to confirm that that's working for folks while I have you here. But just to make sure, once you go to that Google form, there will be a link where you can just upload the documents, the proposal documents, as well as any other relevant documentation that you think might be helpful to support your proposal. So it's not required for those supplemental information, but if you think it's necessary, happy to receive it. In terms of the selection timeline, proposals are due February 1st. The strategic working group is overseeing this process, and some of those members are in a selection task force. So the way it works is a little bit iterative, where you have the sub task force that goes into all the nitty-gritty details, goes through and processes through things, and then we take it back to the broader working group for consensus and for agreement. And so trying to make sure that we do due diligence, make sure the process is thorough, and make sure it's transparent. We're providing updates to the network as we go through. And so this is a timeline that is it looks a little bit different, but the same information is available on Basecamp. So if you're a part of Basecamp, it's there. And if you do not have access to it, I'm happy to upload a copy to the chat as well. But proposals will be due in February. Finals will be selected for interviews late February. And then there will be processing those interviews in March with a final selection intended for the end of March. A transition period should begin in April. And we also are trying to plan some all network meetings around that time as well, so that the host organization, as well as the strategic working group and all the different players involved, can come together and go off on a really strong foot. So that is the general timeline. I want to open up for questions. Emily, I see you.
Sorry. So are you anticipating then that the strategic working group will be advertising for the coordinator once that decision is made? Or like how do you view that part of the transition happening?
Yeah, absolutely. The local coordinator position, we are planning. We're already talking about what that looks like right now in the transition period. So there's a conversation happening in the strategic working group about what the transition looks like once a host organization is identified, and the local coordinator role is involved in that. So we want to respect that, because that person is the official employer, they will need to be involved in some capacity. So that is the intended timeline, not strict, but at the same time after.
Okay, thanks.
Feel free to drop questions in the chat or unmute.
Miriam, I had a couple of questions, or I guess maybe just a little bit of conversation around the items outlined in the first year expenses, and that in particular the administrative coordinator. So thinking about, that delicate balance, figuring out how the host organization would handle direct support, indirect support. But I was thinking about a little bit more information around, helping to prepare reports or the accounting of the grants, and sort of how, and again, is that part of the proposal? But I think I've had a couple of questions come my way where folks were just asking about basically how much work would this be to a host organization? And does the host organization ideally already have administrative staff and processes in place to be able to roll this into the other work that those individuals are doing versus something that might be on a little bit more of a shoestring staff and budget?
Right. That makes sense. No, thank you, Heather. I think the intention behind, so two things. First, the transitional funding is going to be different from long-term funding arrangements, right? So for this next year, it's going to be through CFA. So it might look a little bit different. There might need to be check-in points or milestones for progress made. That might be 2-3 times a year, being able to just check in and see how things are going as an arrangement. It might require some form of an interim report. But the motivation behind that is not to create additional work, but rather to create check-in points to make sure that the relationship is healthy between the strategic working group and the host organization and CFA, who is accountable to Hines for how those funds are being administered. So to answer your question, Heather, it hasn't been decided yet. So my role within the Water Network is to help facilitate conversations, structure those meetings, and provide support as recommendations or decisions are made by the strategic working group. And that's something they will be covering in coming meetings. But the intention behind it is not to create undue administrative burden.
Thank you.
Yeah. If you were able to access that Google form, could you just pop that in the chat really quick? The way we had it set up, because we are having people receive files through the Google form, it was requiring a login. So we changed it, and hopefully that's updated now. So you should have access if you're not using a Gmail.
I could access the feedback form, but where is the link for submission? What page is it on?
Yeah, let me find that really quick.
Oh, wait, I got it. It's on, I think 8.
Yeah, there we go. But yeah, so that's the end of my content. Please feel free to ask any questions. We'll provide this recording on the Water Center project page as an external facing. Oh, perfect. Thanks, Emily. Perfect. So that relieves me. Okay, good. We want to make sure that people are actually able to submit the proposals. But we're going to provide a copy of this recording on the Water Center project page, as well as Basecamp for anyone who's already a part of the network. We just want to make sure that all the information is easily accessible and make sure the process is transparent and thorough. We will also be creating a frequently asked questions page with questions that have come up through the strategic working group, as well as network members or this meeting, so that people have all that information together. Yeah, Heather.
Yeah, I have somewhat of a silly question, but I'm just thinking about our organization's capacity to do something like this. And logistically, one thing that really stands out when creating like a fair working space is, unfortunately, like that salary is higher than any of our staff. And I find it would be very problematic to have someone as a staff person in this capacity as the highest paid salary person, and like, which would be fantastic. I'd be like, well, let's just raise everyone's salary to that, but we just don't have that ability. And I'm curious if there would be a way to move that around to hire that part-time, so raise a part-time person's salary to more of a full-time and increase capacity that way, because it just really wouldn't be fair. I mean, I would love to be able to do that. It just, if they're an actual employee of our organization, I wouldn't feel comfortable with that unless there was funding to like raise everyone's salary to $70,000.
Absolutely, I hear you on that. I would say that position isn't able to go to part-time. It was at the recommendation that you're providing? Because I want to make sure I understand.
No, it would be to lower their salary and move those funds to have an increased salary in the part-time so they can work more hours and have more hours worked. So keep the full-time person, and maybe you'd have to adjust maybe some of those requirements. But for a coordinator, that's pretty high in the nonprofit world salary for just someone as a coordinator. But maybe I'm wrong, and we just don't pay our staff members enough, which is true. But that's just we're pretty consistent with other nonprofits as far as I know, at least in this region. And so unfortunately reduce their salary, of course, keep all the benefits and things like that, keep the full-time, adjust according to what we're asking when we're looking for a new staff person. But then we would have more funding to pay that part-time person for more hours. Does that make sense? Or
that makes sense.
Am I the only person who was a little surprised that a coordinator was at $70,000?
Really? I'm curious to see, for the folks, we wanted to make sure, at least in the proposal, we wanted to make sure that we were able to include a competitive rate to make sure that we were setting the network up for success. Because the last thing we wanted to do was propose a salary that was so low that people weren't interested in applying for the position. And so I don't know that I can necessarily speak as to whether or not that salary stays or goes. I don't necessarily think that that's my decision. However, it is something worth discussing in the strategic working group about what that transition looks like and how detailed these line items are in that budget. I'm curious because I've heard that there's been some issues with both turnover and with hiring in the region. Is that something that you all have observed?
Just 2 cents here. At the district, we've been lucky enough to be able to grow a little bit this year. And so it is a very tight labor market. The Great Resignation is real. People are expecting higher salaries. But, as a strategic working group member, the skills that this individual, I think, will need to attract an individual that is capable of doing the work of being asked, I think it is an appropriate salary. I think, perhaps it's a larger conversation around pay in the nonprofit sector, is certainly viable. And so I'm not at all minimizing the situation of public sector and nonprofit work for sure, but to attract very strong talent, that we can't operate on, what I mean? I think it's an appropriate salary, but just again, my 2 cents. But for background too, our organization has gone through a process of benchmarking salaries and resources and tasks and job descriptions against a couple of data points in terms of, is what we pay appropriate? And so I think there's just a bigger, larger conversation in the region, but it's a very difficult hiring market at the moment.
Well,
Absolutely.
Maybe another way to ask Heather's question is, what sort of experience level are you expecting this person to come in with? Because at that salary level, you are looking at more of an executive type functioning person, I think.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you had brought that up, because that was kind of the way I was going to pivot. Was I think sometimes when we see coordinator, it can mean a lot of different things. And so I would say that it is probably very similar to the type of work that I personally am doing. So I can speak from personal experience over here. But it does require, a coordinator is not, I know what it isn't. It isn't an executive director. I think a lot of times if you're thinking from nonprofit sense, you're like, oh, okay, is it the executive director to oversee everything? No. If we could phrase one thing to describe the role, it would be supportive liaison. So it's the person that's connected to all the different activities that are going on, but not just connected, also thinking critically about how to facilitate conversations in a way that support productive momentum. How do we get people to connect with each other? So it's less about, it's not just putting together a bullet point for a meeting. It's also trying to think strategically about establishing trust and communication from folks that don't necessarily have to be in that room. People in the network don't have to be here, and yet they still choose to come because there's added value. So being able to identify that added value and being able to cultivate that in meetings takes a little bit additional facilitation skills. I think also it's looking at interpersonal connecting and also being able to identify opportunities for joint funding or proposals and going after that. So I would say that in the coordinator role, you're thinking about the meetings with the strategic working group and kind of strategic planning for the network, but you're also thinking about general networking, like trying to bring together informal sessions between folks around certain areas like source water protection or about like stormwater flooding or different areas and figuring out what that is, and then organizing all network meetings, and then interacting with the different stakeholders for funding opportunities and figuring out how those work together. So it's a lot of different interpersonal reactions. It's not necessarily administrative support like you might associate with a typical coordination role, but it's also not oversight like you would see in an executive position. So it's somewhere in the middle. Yeah, Mary, that's a yeah, strategic coordinator makes a lot of sense. We also want to emphasize that it should be local. It should be someone who's in the space in the area. Local strategic coordinator.
Hi, Miriam.
Yeah.
I'm Alicia Trexler. I'm with the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy, and I hear Heather's question, and I hear both of the Heathers, and I agree that it is a nice salary for sure. Having a salary, if I was coming in and applying for this position and then knew I was responsible for fundraising for my cost for the next several years, that might make me nervous is and it's because I have experience looking at grants, who's going to fund that position as well as the work in the future. So that would be just, I understand why Heather's like, I don't know if we need to back it down or not, because I mean,
Absolutely.
So that's probably, hey, if we got the funding this year, that's great. How do we find it for the next 5 years?
Absolutely. No, that's a great point, Alicia, and great to meet you. No, absolutely. I think something that we've discussed is working with, in that transition period, working with the host organization to establish some initial contacts for submitting additional proposals. So what would it look like to submit another proposal to Heinz Endowments for an additional year's funding, or being able to establish potential funding sources moving forward. So I fully agree with what you're saying. You want to make sure that there's sustainability to the position that you're hiring for. That being said, in strategic working group meetings, we have talked about it's important that the ownership for funding is within the entire network and not just the coordinator. You don't want them to have to be coordinating the entire network and also wondering if they're going to have funding for an additional year. And so that ownership is something that needs to be reflected within strategic working group members as well as the network members.
Okay,
So
yeah, that's good too. And I have one other part of the question for the role of this coordinator is, and forgive me for not being caught up with what the working group has been doing all along, but was there any consideration or want of this person to be a lobbyist as well, or is it not? And I don't know which way that goes. I'm just curious, so I know what to say about it.
Absolutely. So this network is specifically neutral. So it doesn't have a political lean, nor does it take the posture of advocacy. Mostly because they want to make sure, like, if network members within want to do advocacy work or lobbying, we fully encourage that, and we welcome people to connect in our neutral space and then take those conversations the way they need to go. But as a network itself and for the local coordinator position, lobbying is not necessarily aligned with the posture of the network. Again, not to say that it's not encouraged from network members in the way that they'd like to do that, but if we're trying to create that common ground or a safe space, we want to make sure that people don't feel like there's invested interest coming into it. That's a great question, though. I really appreciate it. anyone else? I'm happy to stay here until the top of the hour. But if you feel like your questions have been answered, hopefully you've gotten a bit of an overview of the network and the submission process, and happy to answer any questions. I'll put my email in the chat, as well as thanks, Heather. And I will also put in questions.
Miriam, it's Mary. You misspelled your email address. Sorry.
Oh man. Okay. You know, it's auto-correcting it. My computer knows better than me.
I think I'll sign off, but thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Emily. Appreciate it.
Bye.
Absolutely. And those were really, really great questions. Absolutely. Heather, I'm just thinking back, like your question was very relevant. And that's something that we've also been considering is where is that balance? And that's just seems like the hiring landscape has been pretty difficult already.
Yeah, I mean, we just hired 2 people, and we had really great candidates, and our salaries are nowhere near this. I mean, and I just did a staff share with another ED at another nonprofit, and my salary is much higher than hers. So, and if my salary is already 10% lower than a coordinator, and a coordinator is, if you're creating positions, that's like one of the lowest ones, like title wise. They don't manage, you know, so not that title matters, but I would, it would be hard, like with our staff, when they're seeing how we title things, what we're asking this person to do. And then if they're not even really responsible for making sure they get their another funding, that's like, okay, that's on the ED, all this stuff, when they're getting drastically higher salaries. And I do believe 70,000 is not like a crazy salary. It's very appropriate with these rising costs of living. So I'm not arguing that. Mine is like, I can't, like, I'm not fair to my staff. I could go to my staff and say, can I equal my pay? Because, you know, it's not a drastic thing, but
absolutely.
But like to be that person, to be that much higher than all of my staff is, I would have a really hard time. Like I'm really for equal pay with all my staff. And just because this person has a grant that has more money, to me, that's not fair. Like, I mean, it makes sense. I mean, exactly. I see where you're running into issues with it, because what you're saying makes absolute sense. Yeah. Like I would love to pay all my staff $70,000. That would be fantastic. I would be the happiest employer ever, but I physically can't. Like you know, I struggle to pay the salaries that we currently have. So yeah, that would probably eliminate us from really being able to do this, because I just morally do not feel comfortable having that big of a pay gap in my staff. That's really how it perpetuates pay gaps by doing things like that. So I don't know, I'll have to think about it. If you want to talk back with your team and see like where they feel about that. You know, I think you're based in Philly, right?
I am, yeah.
Pittsburgh's drastically cheaper. So like, you know, and if they're in the whole Southwestern network, if they did want to live outside of Pittsburgh, you know, they can, like, so I don't know if like, if that's a consideration for you all, or if 70 is the required amounts. Not that this person couldn't be paid much higher than like my other staff. I just feel like that much higher is just like, I couldn't justify it to them. And that would make probably my other staff quit, you know? So, I mean, I know I've left in the past because of a giant pay gap for me doing similar work for less pay. And this person would be doing similar work to one of my other staffs who makes, you know, a little more than half of that, you know? So it's like, how do you, I don't know, maybe it's just me who's having these internal dilemmas, but I do know other nonprofits similar, you know, those that are under 5 employees would be in that realm.
Yeah.
Of course, the large, and so maybe small nonprofits aren't the direction you want to go, because they can't pay their staff, but we can't grow either if we don't get opportunities. So
Yeah.
I don't know. I know you can't answer the question or anything. I'm just
No, but I hear what you're saying though. Like what you're saying makes sense. I understand where you're coming from with it for sure. No, and I appreciate you being candid about it, because I think that if you're asking that question, there's probably someone else who's also asking it. So
yeah. And yeah, so even if like, let's say I, you know, went ahead with this and I was comfortable with them making more than me, which is fine. And, you know, our pay difference isn't drastic where like I could request like, hey, we're taking on this challenge. Can I increase my funding? But then that just increases the gap between me and my other staff. And that makes me really uncomfortable. And then, you know, obviously I could, you know, maybe fight for a little raise with them. And then it's like, okay, everyone, we're all increasing. And now we could have hired another staff person instead of, you know, but maybe that's the appropriate thing to do is give us all raises. So it's just like, it adds a whole complexity that I just don't know if we're capable to take on or.
Right.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. Definitely worth considering.
But,
Yeah, I agree with you, Heather. I mean, like, I see all of that and everything. And I mean, shooting from the hip, when I was just having a conversation about this yesterday, not having any numbers in mind, I thought this is like maybe a $45,000, $50,000 position. That's what I thought I was coming into. So, and it's might be a little sticker shock seeing that, but it's not, I mean, it would be great. I agree with Heather too. It would be great to be able to pay everybody that, but it's definitely, I think there's a lot, she has justified a lot of good reasoning on, you know, hiring someone at that level with that many differences. And I know in our watershed, and I work under Jennifer Chrisman, if you didn't know where I'm at in our watershed office at the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy. So, but yeah, this person would be paid more than almost the entire department.
No, absolutely. Yeah, we will have those conversations with the strategic working group about that for sure. Absolutely. Well, thank you, everyone. Any last questions before I jump off? I really appreciate you staying and being willing to talk more about it.
well, thanks for listening. I know it's not anything that you can do, but thank you.
And give some context to what we're working with, because we want to make sure it also it's a great opportunity for host organizations, and we will make sure it is, as well as sustaining the network long term. So absolutely need to understand where people are coming from. So I appreciate it. Thanks, everyone. I appreciate it. Take care.